Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name's Adam Wurr from. Oh, we have got the man of the hour. As the panel assembles, I'll do the general introduction. As I said, my name's Adam Wurr. I'm an affiliate here at the Centre of Geopolitics at Cambridge. And a long-standing career diplomat in the Foreign Office. The reason I'm standing in front of you today is that this panel event comes at the end of the latest in our grand strategy simulations, where we assemble a room full of experts, including politicians, serving officials, military officers, diplomats, and so on. And we essentially recreate an artificial, you'll be pleased to hear, sense of crisis, which we put in front of the group who take their roles as they would if the crisis were real around the crisis centre known as COBRA in central government, as you would have heard, and as you will be aware of. And we play the role during the day, a dynamic situation, and we test various assumptions and behaviours amongst the people, the government officials, and so on around the table. Importantly, because we're doing this here at Cambridge University, we also have in the room students, undergraduates, postgraduates, academic staff. And so this is, for the centre and for us, one of our prime ways that we integrate and make real the work of the centre and bring it back to the art and practice of statecraft in government. Today, we, under the expert premiership of Quasi, we were looking at something which is highly topical. Those of you who've been looking at the news today will see that it's a changing scenario. We've been looking at the big picture of trade and geopolitics and how the current behaviour, policy choices of the Trump administration and the tensions between China and the US are playing out, not just for those two superpowers, but for the rest of us. So particularly for the UK, but also the UK in terms of how it relates to the EU, and how we forge a stable and sensible trade policy, taking into account all of our various interests. Just to make it even more difficult, we set our imagined scenario a week before Trump was due in the UK for his second state visit, which I hope put some of the participants on their mettle. But before I hand over to our esteemed panel, I would ask those of you who are interested, have a look at our website. If you look at simulations up, you will find more about our model. Stay engaged. We had a number of potential exciting supporters and donors participate today. We're hoping to turn this into something even more relevant for the policymakers of the future. So please enjoy the discussion, which will draw on the findings that we reached, and we look forward at the end to joining with you in the audience to continue discussion over a glass of wine. So, Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. So my name is Suzanne Rain. I sit on this panel simply as a compere, for I am not an expert on geopolitics and trade, but I've got three people who are. And so my role is to welcome and then cajole. Firstly, Dr. Hugo Bromley, who is a research associate now at the Centre for Geopolitics. Then Professor Bill Hurst, who is one of the two directors of the Centre for Geopolitics, and also the Chonghua Professor of Public Development. Chinese Development. And then probably needs little introduction, Kwasi Kwarteng, former Secretary of State at BEIS and Chancellor of the Exchequer. And we've been discussing which order we should do this in, given the breaking news stuff. I was just looking on the BBC, and Trump has said that America has achieved a total reset in relations with China. So I suppose my first question, I'm going to ask Hugo first, because Hugo's been working a lot in America, is this is all fixed now then, Hugo?
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, Kwasi and I were talking about this just before the panel. When I came to Cambridge to do my PhD 5 years ago or more, actually, I said I want to do something really academic and really obscure that no one works on, so I'll do the history of the tariff, which has somewhat changed in its relative historical importance in the last few months. I think, how long do you want me to, do you want me to go on all the way 15 minutes, or do you want short questions?
Do an introductory
Fine.
comment, and then we'll get Bill in.
Yeah. It's important to understand that what has happened over the last 3 months is an experiment in what the president can and cannot do in terms of trade policy, and is a very rapid attempt at negotiation based on decoupling. The legal basis of the tariffs was always very difficult. We went very high initially. What's happened today is that the tariffs passed under something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act have come all the way back down from 145 to 30%. That is still a very large tariff on China. But what we have seen over the last few months is the incredible danger of moving rapidly towards a new structure of the international trading system without planning or due preparation. That holds enormous risks for US small businesses in particular, which are way more dependent on trade with China than they are with global trade in general. So for context, about 23% of trade with Canada and Mexico for the United States is linked to SMEs. For China, that number is 43%. So it's a completely different character of trade based on the offshoring of production, right? So as we have seen these rapid disruptions, we've been looking at huge disruptions of American society, also huge financial stability risks, because obviously if those businesses all start going bust at once, that has potentially terrifying repercussions. So we have seen a rapid realization in the Trump administration of something that a lot of people could have told him going in, and some people did, which is that if you want to restructure the global trading system either entirely or in strategic sectors, you have to move gradually, you have to provide certainty to businesses, and you have to listen and help businesses and third states through that transition. In other words, you have to do this through some degree of cooperation rather than rapid coercion. None of that means that the structural problems that President Trump is trying to address, of sustained Chinese overcapacity, of real issues with the current global trading system, are not there. They're as there this afternoon as they were this morning. And the need to think about how, in a time of increasing geopolitical competition, we restructure and reconsider the global trading system, that still remains. That hasn't changed.
I'm just thinking, because this is introductory comments, I think it would be helpful, Bill, to have from the Chinese perspective, or Chinese and American perspective, the response to where we are today. The issue today is that we're doing geopolitics and trade, and we've got some breaking news which is about a total reset in the relations. And I suppose Hugo's given us an introduction on the US side,
I see.
but your expertise is in the China side, but actually it's also in the US-China relations thing.
Sure. So I think this is a crisis entirely of American making. It is basically because Trump has decided to impose tariffs that, interestingly, are completely antithetical to everything that macroeconomists have been arguing for 50, 60 years, right? So, when I was an undergraduate and I studied with the crazy left-wing economics faculty in University of Chicago, their claim was that tariffs are always counterproductive. They will always do more harm than good to both parties in the relationship. If we go all the way back to sort of free trading orthodoxy of a much earlier age, the general bottom line is always that more trade is good trade, right? It doesn't absolutely matter what the balance of trade is as such, but that there should be more trade rather than just less of it. Increasing tariffs will reduce the total volume of trade. Therefore, I think a lot of people from a lot of different viewpoints, would say that what the Trump administration has undertaken, both in its first iteration and now in its reincarnation, is foolhardy to America's purpose. If we think about other issues that supposedly are trying to be addressed through this policy, notably so-called overcapacity, right, that was mentioned. Yes, there's tremendous overcapacity in China's economy. This is a huge problem domestically in many sectors. 40 years ago, it was in certain parts of agriculture. There was overcapacity in the produce of certain fruits and so on. Now it's in electric vehicles. Before that, it was solar panels and bicycles and a bunch of other things. US tariffs aren't going to stop that. This is happening for all kinds of institutional reasons inside China's domestic political economy. The other fallacy, I would say, of US policy right now is that they're about 25 to 30 years out of date in terms of their understanding of the relative importance for China of the United States and the relative balance of power in the global economy between the United States and China. So if this policy were undertaken in the 1990s, it would almost certainly cause more negative effects in China than in the United States, and it would probably have an effect of forcing China to some sort of negotiating table. Today, no. It's certainly going to hurt China. It will hurt certain sectors quite significantly, but it will not change China's behavior in a fundamental way. There's too much for China to lose in other areas. The trade relationships with Southeast Asia in particular, and Europe in addition, are already significantly larger than China's trade relationship with the United States. And in the case of Southeast Asia, it's growing rapidly, right? Whereas the US is in decline. The US itself is in decline. The US-China trade relationship is in decline already before these tariffs. So I think China will view this pretty clearly as the US pointing the gun very much at its own foot, and will wait for the US to figure out the foolhardiness of this course of action and to correct itself. When that happens, it should help China to look more like the honest player, like the guarantor of stability, and like increasingly the center of gravity in the global economy. That's the hope, certainly from China's angle. The risk is that the tariffs and other erratic policies from the United States could damage the Chinese economy more than they foresee. It also could break the global trading system to such an extent that it will cause catastrophic harm to China and others before this eventual correction could come into place. From the US side, all I can say is I don't have any magic listening capacity into the Trump administration. But looking more broadly at sort of the US political discourse, I think there's a fairly strong consensus among most people with any degree of expertise that this is not a wise course of action. Many in the Republican Party are deeply troubled by the way this is going, to say nothing of those in the Democratic Party or in other areas. The business community obviously is not happy. And as Hugo pointed out, small businesses in particular are going to be most strongly affected. The other people who will be affected, both from the angle of higher prices for Chinese imports, but also from the angle of simply scarcity in some sectors, will be consumers, right? It will almost certainly increase inflation at the point of consumers actually making purchases. And so that's not going to help the US economy. It's also not been good for US politics. I think it's divided the country more sharply than it was divided before, and has, to some extent, painted the administration into a rather narrow corner.
So I agree with some of what Bill has said. I mean, Bill has very much given the orthodox view, okay? This is slightly crazy, you know, we've got free trade, free trade benefits everyone globally. But of course, Trump is not answering that exam question. He's got a base, he's looking at the hollowing out of American industry and manufacturing. And I'm not suggesting that this is the right answer, but he's trying to answer a question that is a different question from the one that Bill is implicitly posing. And I think Hugo is right to say that there was a problem in the method, in the delivery. And I know that from the mini budget. You try and do a million things at once, there's risk in that. Whereas if you slice and dice things and do it over maybe 6 to 8 months, there's probably less risk in that. But sometimes, you know, the impulse is to try and make a big dramatic statement. Quick introduction to myself. I mean, yes, I've had a political career, but my actual formation, the French call it, is very much in economic history. And if you look at the economic history of the United States, and it's a boring subject, I promise you, but actually a lot of what Trump says is not that inconsistent with where America was for about 150 years. Strong internal market. If you look at Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, you know, the eponymous musical, people like Henry Clay, Lincoln, Grant, the great general and president, McKinley, latterly, they were all protectionists. They were all protectionists. This idea that America was a paean and a sort of paragon of free trade from 1789, when the first president was inaugurated, to now is nonsense. From 1789 to 1930, protection was, I'm afraid, whether we like it or not, the single most consistent economic platform that they had. Henry Clay, someone you probably haven't heard of, he called it the American system. It was built on three things: a central bank, internal infrastructure, and protection. So when Trump talks about protection and he talks about, you know, building up American industry, this is historically very significant. And it was the issue that, in many ways, you get people even now who say the Civil War wasn't about slavery. Of course, we know it was. It was about protection. The Northerners were protectionists. They wanted to protect their industries. So what Trump is doing isn't crazy. I think the method that he used was dumb because he tried to do everything at once. And from personal experience, I know that doesn't work, or is unlikely to work. And secondly, I think that, you know, I don't think he knew what he was doing. Having said all of that, what Hugo said about the tariff rate is very significant. He, I think, posited 145% tariff on China, and now it's down to 30%. Everyone's claiming a huge victory. If you'd said there'd be 30% tariff on China 10 years ago, people would be horrified. He shifted the terms of debate with extreme positions at the beginning. And this is the last book I ever want you to read, but it is all in the art of the deal. I mean, that's what he says. He says, you come up with the most outrageous position, and then you come to somewhere that you want. And I think he's done the same thing. Probably not by design. I think he's a sort of disruptor, and he's explosive, and he's impulsive. But I think he's roughly in a place where many people would think we wouldn't get to. So those are my introductory remarks. Boiled down, if you look at the history of the United States, what he's saying isn't completely insane. I think he completely messed up the delivery. But the fact is, where we are is a lot further down the tariff global trade war route than many of us would be comfortable with, and that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago.
You're dying to speak.
I think this is a fascinating conversation, and it's good that we've already got into the meat of it. There are two questions. One is, where is US trade policy going? The other is, can anyone trust United States trade policy to be in a consistent place for any extended period of time? And the danger of what has happened, the greatest problem with what's happened over the last 3 months is we are no longer in a position where we can trust the US policy once it has agreed. We have agreed with the United States what the policy is. We can't trust it to stay there. And in many ways, the challenge the UK faces, and we can talk about the recent deal soon, because I think it is actually potentially in some ways very exciting for the UK. But the difficulty is, how do we institutionalize whatever settlements we get to such that we're not back here negotiating again in chaos again in 2, 3, 4 years' time? And to me, that answer runs through Congress rather than the presidency. And if we look at that longer history you describe, it was a history in which tariff policy was controlled by Congress. What we have seen since the 1970s is a number of particular exemptions on emergency response, what was then called anti-dumping, and on national security, shift control of tariff rates in the US from Congress to the presidency. What is interesting is, how do we get back to a point where the US is a reliable actor? Part of the answer may lie through Congress, particularly if in the long run, as Bill rightly points out, many in the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party are getting uneasy. On the China overcapacity question, I think it's right that there's nothing the US can do that will stop that for the internal reasons you describe. The question is, how does the US lead a coalition? And how does the US reach out to third countries who have those trading relationships with China, like the United States? And China's pitch, and I've written about this, is we are the more inclusive vision of globalization. We are the more sort of multipolar, multilateral vision of globalization. The US has set a lot of its credibility at risk over the last 3 months. But there is a theoretical pitch that exists that goes, we are the people who understand that you have national interests, that you have a national right to develop, and wherever in your own trading relationship with China you believe there are imbalances, we will help you in using whatever tool you want to correct those imbalances. I suppose the most extreme example of this is that even Russia, of all countries, has begun to become very, very uneasy about the scale of imports, manufacturing imports from China, particularly autos, as a threat to domestic employment. So this is a global question, and there is a path the US and its core allies, like the UK, could take that is potentially very exciting. This wasn't the way to take it, and it's given us a whole additional problem around trust and credibility.
Bill, do you want to come back on?
Sure, I can come back first on this issue of protectionism as the actual American orthodoxy. And I agree that it was the case if we go all the way up to at least the Civil War. Since the founding of the United States, up to at least the Civil War, and I would say at least the 1880s, if I'm not incorrect in my memory, the majority of US federal revenue was coming from the Customs House in the Port of New York. Just next to Federal Hall, where President Washington was first inaugurated, on Wall Street, next to the Stock Exchange. But this reliance on tariff and on the taxation of international trade was real. It was real for many countries at that time. The US certainly did perceive things in that vein. When I was referring to this classical free trade orthodoxy, I was actually thinking of people like David Ricardo, and not particularly the American policies of the 19th century. If we then go a little bit more forward in US history, Smoot-Hawley was the last tariff, I think, as was discussed in a couple points, which was actually enacted by Congress, and it was enacted right at the dawn of the Great Depression and had disastrous effects, at least by most accounts I've ever seen. That's right. And since then, there's been a reluctance to do that. But I would actually extend the protectionist age further forward than 1930. I'd go all the way to 1980. That really only in the 1980s did this consensus around the need for some kind of protectionism begin to break down. And again, that crazy left-wing radical Ronald Reagan is the person who pushed the US into the free trade space through a series of debates during the 1980s about whether or not to tariff Japan.
But he slapped tariffs on, he saved Harley Davidson. With
Yes.
a 60% tariff.
True.
He could see that the Japanese were taking the American motorbike industry, for lunch, and he slapped a 60% tariff to protect US motorbikes. So the idea that he was some paragon of free trade can be questioned.
It's also not an instantaneous move. It happened, as you were talking about earlier, in bits and pieces.
Sure.
So if we start in the early 1980s,
I agree
and we
with
go
you, but I'm
through
just saying,
things like the Plaza Accords,
this
and we
history
get
is
to-
way more complicated
Yes, it is.
than people, not you, but people sometimes think.
But I think we only really get to the free trade consensus in the United States with Bill Clinton.
I agree with that.
But that goes through a series of phases, and I do think the jumping off point for that very much was Reagan, and very much was a Republican business orthodoxy in the 1980s, which was opposed, by the way, by organized labor and the Democratic Party very fiercely throughout that same period, all the way up until NAFTA. NAFTA was the first time that Clinton was able actually to diffuse enough of that opposition to pass a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, by the way, with Republican support and Democratic opposition still. So this is not, the triumph of the right over the left to put in protection. there was something else I was about to talk about.
Can I just point, because I happened to be in America when Trump announced his presidential run in 2015. I was in New York, I wasn't in the room. But he said, but two things he said, and I stood up and thought, oh my God, he might actually get very far. The first thing he said, he was going to close down the border. So if you were an industrial worker in, let's say, Detroit or in Illinois generally, or wherever, in Wisconsin, your biggest fear was that you were going to get undercut by Mexican immigrants. That's a big fear. And your second biggest fear, probably your biggest fear, was that your plant that you were working at was going to be offshore to Shenzhen. And Trump addressed those two issues. He said he was going to build a wall, very crudely, keep the immigrants out. And he was also going to put a tariff on China. Those are the two things. And I remember watching it in real time and thinking, oh my God. I don't know whether he'd focus grouped it. I don't know whether that was his intuition. But in terms of protecting the American industrial base. Now, I don't agree with this, but there's a method in the madness, okay? And it was very striking from my point of view that when he put tariffs on China in his first term, Biden didn't remove them. He didn't remove the tariffs on China. He kept them. So I'm afraid the same thing might happen. If he puts a 30% blanket tariff on various countries, the idea that this is just going to disappear when he leaves office, I think is fanciful.
There are a couple of other things to point out, though. First of all is that Biden did leave in place some of these tariffs. That's true. I'm not sure that was the wisest thing for him to have done. What he also did, though, is to pass the CHIPS Act and several other restrictions on exports and technology controls. That, I think, is much more effective. The CHIPS Act plus the Inflation Reduction Act actually sets out a more broad-based industrial policy that assists U.S. Business and restricts.
But the effect is the same. Big picture, you're keeping out foreign competition.
But it's not completely the same. You're keeping out foreign competition in a different way. You're fostering domestic industry versus fostering
so you're giving
domestic
subsidies
inflation.
as opposed to putting tariffs.
But another issue just to bring up quickly is that there was talk about overcapacity. And if we think about overcapacity in China, that is not something the Chinese government is trying to shoot for, right? Overcapacity is quite harmful to China in a very important way that we continually fail to notice here, I think, which is deflation. Deflation is a huge problem in China precisely because of overcapacity in all of these sectors. And so therefore it's not something that the government is pleased about. It's not a strategy for external trade. The external trade ramifications of overcapacity are sort of negative externalities of a domestic problem that the government actually is not trying to create, but is in fact trying to solve. And so all of these moves to try to build coalitions against Chinese exports or something like this, I think will be of very limited utility in changing the fundamental structure of China's political economy. It may induce certain countries to behave differently. I don't think so, actually, because for most of the world, China is a more important trading partner than the United States, and increasingly so.
Okay, so this is a good introductory conversation. I think it would be helpful now, just in terms of setting out some of the topics, to discuss the UK-US deal, which has also recently been announced. And in a way, this is still not about geopolitics, it's about domestic politics and trade as being an aspect of that. So the domestic politics of the UK also depend on this being a good deal for the UK, I think, don't they? So, Hugo, is it a good deal for the UK?
The short answer is I think so, yes. However, it is neither straightforward nor a deal. And to be really clear about the second point, this is an agreed framework for further work. It's not a trade deal. There is a specific criteria for a trade deal, which is that full trade deals with the US have to pass through the Senate. And this is not, because of what we talked about earlier, about the president taking control over tariff policy in a way that has been described in this debate, this is not a full trade deal. So that point about consistency and reliability I made earlier still holds. But let's look at the deal itself. The UK has made a symbolic concession, which is that we've moved away from the concept of most favoured nation, which is that absent a full free trade deal, you can't discriminate your tariff. That's a founding principle of much of the current multilateral system and central to the WTO. We've moved away from that. Instead, we have a world in which the UK is given beneficial access to the US market, not in terms of these reciprocal tariffs, which I don't think are particularly stable in many of their forms, but in terms of the extension of the tariffs passed under Trump 1 and Biden on products and sectors. So the UK gets beneficial access. There is also to be an evolving dialogue between the UK and the US on economic security, which in practice means two things. One, it means looking at supply chains for high-end products, looking at the role of China in those supply chains, and where at all possible, reducing that role, and a cooperative UK-US relationship in doing that. And secondly, it means work on transshipment, which is very obviously, I have a Chinese product, I want to sell it inside the United States, I don't want to call it Chinese, I ship it to Vietnam, I change the label, I ship it on, which is going to become an increasing problem in the global trading system as tariff rates go up in a differentiated way. So that's in many ways the core of the deal. I think it's potentially very exciting for the UK because I think it does show in the long run that we can get preferential access to the US market. And as more and more high-end trade, and Bill was rightly highlighting CHIPS Act and IRA earlier, as more and more US trade is securitized at the high end, they want trusted trade partners more, and that means the UK. The problem is the reliability, but it's funny you mentioned domestic politics. We've been negotiating trade deals or trying to negotiate trade deals with our other major trading partner, the European Union, since, well, Brexit. And we have tried and tried and tried to say we need a bespoke deal that reflects our unique security contribution and relationship with Europe, and got nowhere. And we got some with the US in 2 months. So it's maybe worth thinking about that contrast as well as all of the issues we've described. We have one key trading partner who are prepared to negotiate, who do see the relationship between security and the economy, are prepared to give us market access, but are very difficult to trust. And we have another trading partner who are incredibly consistent. Nobody has ever said that the European Commission negotiating trade are not consistent, but also won't bend, and recently were apparently in some forms trying to link security cooperation to a UK concession on fishing rights. So that we have these two very different problems with our two biggest trading partners. Right now, there's a path forward you can see with both, but getting there will remain hugely challenging.
Bill, you're nodding.
I have not yet really been able to parse what I think the particular implications of this US-UK deal are. I do take on board, though, the fact that by many analyses, the trading relationship is in a worse state than it was a few months ago after the supposed deal. But I also see some room for these kind of cooperative arrangements that are not strictly about trade or the terms of trade that Hugo was making allusion to, whether that's China's role in supply chains or some other kind of securitization of different areas of the economic relationships. What I think is also, though, astounding to me is that we have not had more of a conversation on the end of the multilateral trading order or trading system. Right? WTO 25 years ago, or a little bit more, was meant to bring us completely free global trade by 2020. Right? There was the free 2020. This was the whole idea, and it was meant to be this very robust organization that would cajole or compel all countries to play by this set of common rules, promote free trade, and discipline those who broke the rules. And now, I mean, in large part, one could argue that once all big economies got into the WTO, which is very soon after 2000, it really ceased to function, at least in terms of dispute resolution or discipline. But now, the classic large Western economies have walked away from it, it would seem, if I'm correct in understanding the implications, as you've just presented, of what this US-UK deal is. So why should anyone else pay any attention to WTO or any of these old order rules? why shouldn't we all just abandon the system? And if we do that, what's left and what comes next? I think that goes far beyond the implications of this single bilateral deal.
Look, so on WTO, I mean, I saw this in government. The world of 2000 could not be more different than the world of 2025. In 2025, we've had COVID experience. We're talking about the energy transition. We're talking about much greater geopolitical uncertainty than 2000, which you will remember is before 9/11. And it's a totally different world. And as a consequence of this, you know, governments are much more looking. We haven't even mentioned critical minerals. We haven't talked about the integrity of the supply chain. We haven't talked about China's dominance of the energy transition in terms of the hardware, the material substance behind it, in terms of, you know, mining. We haven't talked about China's abuse, frankly, of the WTO, because China gets into the WTO 2001, but they carried on just as before. Do you want some water? Yes, please. We need a beaker here. So, you know, as we responded to things like COVID, as we responded to the spike in gas prices, as we've responded to Chinese dominance in critical minerals, supply chain, computer chips, semiconductors, that sort of thing, you know, we've had a much more robust response across the West in terms of security of energy, security of supply, and I'm afraid that has meant that the world of 2000, where we were all looking at more free trade and more globalization, we haven't even talked about populism. You know, the world is a very different place than it was in 2000.
I think it's really interesting to think about this kind of evolutionary thing. Sometimes in public discourse, it's imagined that the WTO was a natural evolution, an inevitable evolution of the post-World War II settlement, which is not true. In fact, there was an attempt to create a global trading regulatory body. It was called the International Trading Organization, or ITO, and it failed in the US Senate, and we got GATT instead. And it failed for the same structural problem that many of these agreements fail, which is the concept of differentiated responsibilities. In other words, how do we create a set of global norms for the global trading system that also gives developing nations the capacity to use the tools they want to use to catch up? And that debate, whether that's on tariffs, whether that's on anything, rumbles on through the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, it is enshrined in the WTO in a really fundamental way that there are different rules on trade for nations of different levels of economic development. There's another really important agreement where it is enshrined, which is Rio, and the foundation of the COP process on climate change, where you get the concept of differentiated responsibilities, where developed nations are going to have to move faster on decarbonization, while developing nations with a right to develop can use fossil fuels for longer. One way to interpret what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is the concept of differentiated responsibilities falling apart, because among many other things, China's economic significance is slightly making a mockery out of those statuses. You talked about the march to free trade by 2020. That's a really good point. We should remember that collapsed with the Doha round. One of the key reasons for the failure of the Doha round was that China was trying to get itself enshrined as a permanently developing nation. And the Obama administration, no less, said, hang on a minute, this is getting quite silly. You can't be forever a developing nation. At a certain point, you are going to have to transition to the same responsibilities as everybody else. If you look at China's industrial strength, a huge amount of that has been based on, less so now, a rapid scale up in fossil fuel consumption to get cheap energy, which is the sort of killer support for so much of what China is doing. So there are bits of the WTO that I actually think are fine and will withstand this. Much of it, the very boring technical stuff on regulatory standards and norms, which is actually really important, and that has managed to carry on. But on trade, we need a new settlement on the concept of differentiated responsibilities. And that, to me, is the central question. And it is a question that China has posed, that successive US presidencies have tried to answer. This clearly hasn't been the answer. So what is it? I think you're right, Bill. That's the right question. But this debate's been around a very long time. It's just very acute now.
I'm going to speak. So I think that, I mean, clearly this is a very complicated subject and we've got a relatively limited period of time. But one of the things that each of you has talked about in different ways is the idea of there being rules at some point for something. And I was really interested in when you were talking about transshipment, actually, because I'm immediately thinking, well, obviously that's going to be what happens next. And then the question is, who's policing that? Because everyone's going to break the rules. So who becomes the universal policeman when everybody's breaking the rules? And that made me think about, again, what you're all talking about, particularly in this is where the geopolitics comes in, this question of conditionality. So you're using the economics as a means of achieving other objectives as well, whatever they are, whether they're geopolitical competitive ones, whether they're domestic ones. There's a quid pro quo in this, which is not just, I want to buy your cotton bales, whatever. There's something else. So how states are using the economy to leverage their interests, which does, I think, Kwasi, that comes onto the rare earths question about which of the countries you need to invest in to secure your supply. And then there's another bit here, which is about the available tools for economic statecraft. And Hugo, you were talking earlier, sorry, this is a long question, but it's this prelude to the second bit. You were talking earlier about the use of sanctions as a means of coercing another state to, I mean, there's a debate of whether they ever worked, but I think now it's clear that it's no longer a tool. It's a tool that has so many unintended consequences that it's become unworkable. So then the question is how states seek to use the economy for geopolitical purposes, given that they don't have that anymore. So I've asked 25 questions of you all now, and you're smiling because I don't know which.
So I'll let Kwasi and Bill come in and then.
If I could just say one thing about this idea of transshipment, just very briefly on that. I think transshipment is maybe too simplistic a concept for how to think about this, because most things today that are sent anywhere around the world are not produced only in one country, right? I mean, even 30 years ago, we used to talk about transnational production or cross-national production networks and sort of the globalization of supply chains. Now they talk about global value chains, which I think is just a fancy way of saying cross-national production networks. But the question then is really not what is the route that this finished good followed before it got to our country or your country or whichever country we're interested in, but rather where did it come from? And how do we establish in some clear and binding way what the country of origin is of that product or service? And in this area, actually, there's been a rather interesting conversation in certain areas of the public and also academic and probably also policy discourse in the US, in fact, over the last few weeks, bits and pieces of which I've heard, which really kind of came to a consensus, as far as I could understand, that US law is pretty clear about trying to sort out what the country of origin is, that there's a pretty robust principle of saying that the country of origin of product X is the place in which raw materials or ingredients are transformed or transubstantiated into the finished product. And it's possible, at least theoretically, and through case law, references to case law, to sort out for any given product what its actual country of origin is. Therefore, all of this worry about transshipment into the US is kind of a lot of puffery. And where we really should be more worried about it, if indeed we're going to be worried about it, is shipments the other way. So, for example, with the CHIPS Act, if we're trying to restrict the export of chips or certain kinds of technology or machinery to make chips or software to design chips to China, how many steps forward do we have to go rather than backward in order to ensure that it doesn't get there? So already, Dutch cargo ships were turned around when the CHIPS Act passed, right, in order to prevent hardware from going to China, which is manufactured only in the Netherlands, but is under a US patent, in order to prevent the manufacture of those ships in China. Now, what if those Dutch cargo ships had not been going to China, but instead they'd been going to Vietnam? And the chips were going to be manufactured in Vietnam, but with a contract to export them all to China. And then what if it's 2 or 3 countries removed? How many countries forward can we trace transshipment of things? And how many should we want to in order to try to achieve a certain kind of security objective? I think that's really the more interesting question than the more technical question of how do we establish country of origin for imports coming in so we know how to tariff.
So forgive me, I think we've got hideously lost in the weeds here. Hideously lost. The fact that Trump is trying to address is a very simple one. And I imagine most people here, yeah, the EU is great. The EU is not designed to foster free trade. The clue is in the name. It's the European Union, it's the European Economic Community. Some people my age and older will remember that. And in that economic community, guess what? They had tariffs against people who were outside the community. This wasn't set up to foster free trade. Even if you are a passionate European, you cannot pretend that the EU is an institution to foster global free trade. You've got the Common Agricultural Policy, which was driven by the French. And the point of that is to protect, and that's the word I use deliberately, French farmers. You've got the Customs Union, which is a free exchange of goods. But the point of that is to protect the manufacturers of goods within the EU against the manufacturers outside the EU. In China, despite the WTO, you've got a whole bunch of regulatory rules. You've got export subsidies, which for the life of me, I don't see how that's different from tariffs in terms of protection, but you can explain that to me over a drink. And these are the chief blocks. And so I'm not a fan of Trump's economic policy, but I can see from his point of view that these institutions are essentially doing what he's only doing what they're doing to him. And of course, the very people that, the columnists, and I write columns a lot myself, the columnists who say this is a terrible infringement of the global order are the very same columnists that were totally behind the EU. And they're not saying that we should reduce the EU's tariffs. So the whole thing is a complete nonsense, actually, in many instances. And this idea that we've got a global system that has embraced free trade over the last 25 years is questionable. And what Trump is doing, I would suggest, is simply trying to, and he believes in tariffs, he believes in all of that for reasons that I've dipped into. But he's essentially, how he would justify it is saying, I'm just doing what the Chinese and the EU are doing. And I think there is some force behind that. The levels might be different, but let's not pretend the EU and China are great paragons of free trade.
Funnily enough, I think we can take these two answers and find a consensus. And actually it goes back to something that you have considerable expertise in yourself, Suzanne, which is counterterrorism. Because if we think about economic statecraft as a concept, it is really a concept of the state's oversight and management of the global economy to advance national objectives. And after 9/11, you have the 9/11 Commission, led by Philip Zelikow as director and a number of others, which discovers that one of the key methods of enforcement is the financial services industry and the dollar system. Because the dollar system gives us oversight of global payment networks, we can use that to track terrorism finance. We're dealing with a transnational threat as part of a global community of states. And so our network of economic statecraft tools needs to move towards that threat. That combines with a consensus, again from the 1990s, that because we have a world of multilateral cooperation, under the UN Security Council actually, we can weaponize the entire global economy to enforce international norms through UNSC mandates. So that's how you get the Iraq Marine Interception operation. That's how you get sanctions regimes against nuclear proliferation in Iran and in North Korea. It's how we get considerable actions through OFAC and other US Treasury agencies against counterterrorism. As that multilateral system breaks down, and as the target of economic statecraft moves from the transnational to the international, to the role of China, to the role of Russia, to the role of rogue states. In many ways, the key transition is actually a moment that has sadly been lost to memory, which is 2013-14, when the Obama administration tries to impose sanctions on Russia, which, when you think about it, didn't make an awful lot of sense because sanctions were things that were done multilaterally by significant actors, and you've just tried to sanction a P5 country. And so what we come up with is this weird halfway house in which Russia is locked out of Western capital markets but can still trade in dollars outside of those capital. It was a very confused fudge that then got upgraded to full sanctions after the full-scale invasion in 2022. But we're in a different world now. And in this new world, the question is, what's our enforcement tool and how does it work? Because we can't use the dollar payment networks that we used before. And so that brings us to not only your point, Bill, on transshipment, but also yours, Kwasi, on everybody's doing it. I disagree slightly on transshipment, because while you're right that the production from raw materials is one argument of the point of origin, if I have a car that I'm importing into the US, its final point of assembly may be in place A, but the products that go into it, which are themselves finished products, have come from all over. The question becomes, has the component breakdown of the final manufactured good been adequately reported? I think you're right entirely that the legal question is clear. The problem is a state capacity question of keeping track of the global economy and where things are. And actually, and you're absolutely right to flag export controls as another example of that. It's an enforcement question.
Can I interrupt to ask a question?
Yeah.
So on the UK-US trade deal,
yeah.
Is a condition in there about transshipment?
Well, I mean,
because if it is, we need to understand what we've signed up to.
Well, it's not a condition because it's not a deal.
Right.
But there is some language in there on transshipment as part of an ongoing economic security
said
dialogue.
that we're not going to allow to happen.
We're going to work with the US to strengthen transshipment enforcement. It really doesn't get any more specific than that. This is a conversation that's in its infancy, but when we think about how we can build that out, one thing to do, as you say, Kwasi, is go to the European Union, is go to other countries and say, look, we're going to pursue our own economic interests and economic statecraft as we see it. You are going to pursue your own thing, and we're not going to agree. What we do have is a common interest in people accurately reporting trade. The EU needs to do that to pursue its own economic statecraft tools, particularly the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a quintessential example of using trade policy to address an imbalance in the global economic system. But for that to work, they have to know where a product's been made, what the component parts are, what's the component breakdown. So what we can potentially construct, I do believe, and this I somewhat, in my writings, I somewhat optimistically call this an economic security cooperation board. What we can do is construct a bunch of states that don't agree on common trade policies, but do have a common interest in enforcing rules of origin, both import and export. And that may be the beginnings of an answer to the question you posed, Bill, about what are the new mandates and structures of the global economy.
Possibly.
Now you get to disagree with me.
No, I don't disagree nearly as much with what you've just said as what you were saying earlier. But I do think one thing that does bear keeping in mind, or is worth bearing in mind, is that we are at what somebody earlier today was calling an inflection point. And I think that that's a really useful kind of metaphor for understanding where the world is in general, but in particular when it comes to sort of global trade. We could put another inflection point somewhere around 1987 or so, and sort of the dawn of what we could call a neoliberal moment, as we were talking about earlier. And I think that really runs up until 2001. With September 11th, with the entry of China into WTO, with the breakdown of some of this enforcement mechanisms and so on, we start to see that beginning to fray in really important ways. Also with the US counterterrorism enforcement around transnational financial flows, right? That is actually beginning to restrict and kind of choke that system of free flow of capital and goods. And nobody saw that. Nobody really talked about that, at least not in most circles that I was listening to over the last 25 years. Now, all of a sudden, we're hit with it. And we're hit with it in the form of this odd deal, which is essentially a retreat from whatever that neoliberal order may have been. But I'm still not convinced we really know where we're going. Maybe we'll have this sort of security board of countries that use trade to achieve security objectives, even though they don't share trading philosophies. That would be interesting. Maybe we'll see something else. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll actually have a global trade war. I have no idea.
So look, the one, and I know this session is coming to an end, but the one thing we haven't talked about is, of course, we talked about free movement of goods. I mean, that's what essentially trade is. But if you look at the sort of liberal trifecta, free movement of capital, which we can talk about, but also crucially, free movement of labor. And that's something which in 25 years in the West, certainly, there's been a huge backlash against this idea that you can have economic migrants. And I think a lot of the Trump success, Farage we've mentioned, Maloney, all these people, these populists, have really fixated on this economic migrant point. And it's linked, regrettably, with the free movement of goods. Because it's saying to people, whether you agree with it or not, that globalization is a threat to your livelihood. Trump has made that point explicitly. And he's saying, as I said earlier, he won't allow immigration, nor will he allow the American industrial base to be offshored to China, nor will he allow exports from China to come in willy-nilly on a sort of favored nation status. And that's a real reversal. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Pat Buchanan in the 90s campaigning against this stuff. And at that time, he was seen as a fringe figure. But Trump has really mainstreamed a lot of that thinking. And a lot of that thinking is very pervasive across the West. And so I just wanted to make a plea that trade policy does have a link with populism and this very rather fierce backlash against economic migration.
Okay, so thank you, panel, for your lively... But what you've done is demonstrate, Trump has made us talk about all these things in a way that we weren't doing, and it's probably really important that we do.
Slow the microphone a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. Thank you. It's really important that we do. We've got a little under half an hour, I think. I would love it if people in the audience wanted to ask questions, if you were brave enough to ask questions. So please do. Is that a hand I see?
So last time I heard Professor William Hurst has an argument that, well, after China joined the WTO in 2001, and WTO's problem-solving mechanism basically comes to a stage of kind of paralyzed. So can you elaborate a little bit about this argument, if I get it correct, because I found it quite relevant to our discussion today. So what happened after China joined the WTO, and how do you evaluate its implications? And thinking retrospectively, do you think that China should be admitted in a way that it was into WTO, or it should be anyway? Thank you.
Over to you, Bill.
Oh, the contentious negotiations over China's WTO accession were sort of front and center in the world of Chinese politics and also US-China relations in particular during the second half of the 1990s, particularly between about 1998 and 2001. And the consensus view among many in China at the time was that Zhu Rongji had basically given away the store. He'd agreed to way too many concessions in order to get into WTO. And I think that a significant view in the United States and in other countries was that Clinton and his administration and Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky and all these people had done essentially the same thing. They'd let China in on too soft terms. And so I think there was a lot of worry in many quarters at that moment over the way that it happened. What happened very quickly after China's accession to WTO, followed, by the way, by a number of other large developing countries, was that you could see the WTO breaking into different blocks. There had always been tensions and problems, largely between Europe and North America and Japan, but now with China in the mix, there were sort of too many different players with very different views of how trade should work. fairly quickly, it came to be that China and the US and some others were constantly hauling one another before the dispute resolution system, and that decisions would be issued and no one was abiding by them. And so this whole mechanism that was meant to discipline and to push everyone into the same set of rules really broke down. And it broke down because it wasn't able to enforce those rules, and it wasn't able to enforce the rules in part because many of the key players couldn't agree with each other on what the rules should be and who was at fault for breaking them. And that's not so much China's deliberate strategy. China didn't enter the WTO in order to break it. China entered the WTO in order to try to be in the tent and play within the system to its own advantage. The problem is China, in pursuing its advantage within the tent, ended up pulling too many different players in too many different directions, such that they sort of pulled out the pegs of the tent eventually, and the whole thing has essentially collapsed.
What a metaphor.
The issue is we didn't see it in real time. Very few people, I think, accurately perceived this dynamic until much, much later. And we're only really seeing the fraying happening now.
The fraying of the tent.
Yes. And the whole thing is basically is caving in now for reasons that don't obviously have to do with China's accession directly, but I think actually have historical roots at that time. There are other things too that I tried to mention, like the US counterterrorism enforcement, other restrictions on financial flows, and what Kwasi quite usefully brought up about the backlash against immigration and the fact that free trade never fully encompassed the free flow of labor, really in any jurisdiction. There were always issues around that, and even things like the European Union. I mean, I would argue that a major reason many people probably voted for Brexit is in fact that they didn't like the free flow of labor within the European Union. So even within a bloc that's constructed to be very much a bloc against others, perhaps, if we agree on that, even within that, there can be problems with the free flow of labor, much more than the free flow of capital or goods, right? There seemed to be less of a political backlash against that. So I'll stop there, but because I'm beyond the question. But essentially, China entered and there was no longer an ability to achieve the kind of consensus necessary to make the rules and enforce them consistently.
I just want to follow up on this and to go back to something that Bill said that I think is spot on, which is that we haven't quite worked out what comes next. There's one other element of China's accession to the WTO which is often overlooked, which is that Hong Kong and Taiwan also joined the WTO separately. They didn't join as separate countries for kind of obvious reasons if you know anything about China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. They joined as something called separate customs territories, which gave them equal and independent status within the WTO to China, and sort of parked the issue of what their system of national government was. This is something that was actually facilitated by a clause in the GATT that had something to do with the Commonwealth. It's complicated. In the first Trump administration, after the passing of the Basic Security Law and the crackdown in Hong Kong, Matt Pottinger and others, who were the kind of China leads in the Trump team, made a case to the WTO that because Hong Kong had been crushed in a fundamental way, it should not be considered a separate customs territory. That was a sort of very clever piece of multilateral manipulation. They were extremely careful while doing that to make sure they did it in a way that didn't touch the question of whether, as it is called in the WTO, Chinese Taipei was a separate customs territory. The administration in Taipei puts particular store by the WTO because it is one of the key institutions where it has a seat at the table and functions as a key actor. If we are going to degrade the WTO, we do need to be aware that we are degrading one of the key fora in which Taiwan is a serious actor and taken seriously. One of the only fora.
Taiwan is allowed to play that role.
What is our replacement for that? Particularly in terms of if China seeks, and Bill, you and I have been having this debate for years, if China seeks to step up its attempts to dictate the terms of Taiwan's access to the global economy. So it's that question of, we created a bunch of deals through this framework. If we're moving away from that framework, we need to find new anchors and new ways of talking about some of these old issues.
So I don't agree with that at all. I mean, I think that if you look at global trade over however many years, most of that time, we would have bilateral agreements. We didn't have a global architecture. I mean, GATT itself, which was created sort of post-45, was indifferent. I don't think it was a success, hugely. If the WTO fails for whatever reason, it's not obvious to me why we should have another overarching body.
We don't need another overarching body, but we need something.
Well, we can have a set of bilateral trading relationships.
We can't have a bilateral trading relationship with Taiwan. They're not a country.
Well,
so on what basis are we trading? It's not a small point.
I think you can take or leave Taiwan. I mean, I've been there. No, seriously. Seriously, in the global scheme of things, yes, they've got semiconductors, but how big is the Taiwanese economy generally? You can have a lot of bilateral relations with the EU, with the United States, with individual countries within the EU and the GCC. You can have all sorts of trade within those countries without an overarching WTO. And if you say to me, oh, well, what are we going to do with Taiwan? I'll say, whatever.
I mean, I think the current government, the Conservative Party and the Trump administration would not agree with you on the question of whatever.
They might do, for geopolitical reasons. I mean, I used to have this debate with Jim O'Neill in Goldman Sachs. His view, is that we don't need any trading deals. There was a view we had all this sort of Brexit stuff, and a lot of the trade deals, and we're going to go out with Kemi and whoever it was, negotiating trade deals. A lot of that was political theatre. If countries want to trade, they will trade. You know, we don't have a trade. There are lots of countries that we trade with where we don't have a trade deal, and I think we lose the substance for theoretical structures too much in this world. We don't have a trade deal with South Africa. We do a lot of trade deal with South Africa. There are lots of countries we can trade with without doing a formal deal, and I think a lot of this trade deal stuff is largely political. I don't think it gets in the way of actual trade itself. The EU doesn't have a trade deal with China, but Germany is a massive trade partner of China.
I would point out they're both members of
the
the WTO.
But I don't think that's...
So we have an audience. This is the audience's time. Adam, oh look, we've got loads of questions. There are 3 people in the front row who all want to ask questions. So do you want to...
Sorry, I'd forgotten about the audience.
First of all, thank you very much for the introduction. I wanted to ask a few short questions. One is, what's your opinion on the impact of the tariff revenue for the US?
How many questions have you got? Sorry.
Let's call it 2.
Okay, 2, good. Just wanted to clarify that.
No, let's call it 2. What's your opinion on the impact of the tariff revenue for the US? And the second question is, I'm studying manufacturing engineering, so forgive me if I forget about the economy for a second. But in manufacturing engineering terms, China and different countries have very distinct positions, and they have distinct capabilities and even natural resources that take a lot of time to recreate in the US, or, for example, rare earth supplies, they cannot reserves, they cannot be moved. To what extent do you think blanket tariffs are just sort of, as you were saying, another way of coercion to apply a blanket punishment, but when really the only purpose of these mechanisms is to focus on a few of those critical areas, as you were saying, the other side of the coin of the CHIPS Act or the other side of the coin of the Inflation Reduction Act?
First of all, I'm really enjoying this. This is great. 2 questions. Tariff revenue. The Trump administration believes in tariff revenue. They believe in it for a number of reasons, and my own view is the 10% basic rate that they've passed under IEEPA, it may be legally questionable, but they would like to keep it no matter what, partly because it helps pay for the tax cut. And the income tax cuts they want to do, and the tax on and some of the other stuff they want to do. So they believe in that. I will leave it to the quantitative no, I won't leave it to quantitative economists. Certain kinds of economists will tell you that doesn't work. In essence, if you do a very basic low-level tariff, it's a kind of sales tax in some ways, but with an opt-out for domestic industry. Well, I'm not going to comment directly on whether that works, but certainly I think the Trump administration see it as a revenue raiser. In terms of skills, I couldn't agree more. And what we need, particularly in these high-end sectors, particularly if you look at pharmaceuticals or robotics and drones, which is another massive one that we're going to have to look at next, is we need certainty and time to build up the capacity to produce outside of China that doesn't exist currently inside China. We had this conversation in Trump 1 about certain sectors. Others are coming down the line. I would say active pharmaceutical ingredients is one that may very well be next. There's large numbers of key inputs in our medicines that only China knows how to make. Now, we can't magically fix that, and you will have looked at many of these things as trade secretary. But I do think there is going to have to be a concerted effort among allies that share interests to build up that capacity. But if you're an engineer, you could tell me better than I could tell you, that's going to take time and work, both in terms of building the capacity and building the skill, building the people. Well, maybe it is with AI and robotics, I don't know. Building the intellectual, human capital, that's the term, isn't it, to do it.
Should we get another question? Yeah.
I'll make a change from Javier and ask just one question. You spoke a lot about transshipment. If I take my phone, there's copper there, probably mined from Australia, bit of tungsten, maybe from India, and maybe it's sort of manufactured in China, maybe India now. What makes this phone from India or from China rather than from Australia? And I then take that point further. You spoke about cars. Take the Mini factory in Oxford. If that plant, in a minute, assembles the whole car, if the US suddenly slaps a massive tariff on the UK, what stops France, for example, having a Mini factory that literally puts 2 doors on and it ships off to the US, assuming that's now not quite a complete component in the UK and is now completed, so to speak, in France, and then reduces that tariff? Does that fit within the transshipment? And then how do policymakers then go against that?
With regard to the phone question, I mean, that's actually a rather technical legal question of what is considered to be the country of origin of product A or product B. And as I was trying to say earlier, I mean, in the US, the law is quite clear that it's about, wherever this substantial transformation of the raw materials into the finished product really took place. And there are mechanisms for sorting out legally what that would be. It does become incredibly complex for many products, not just phones. Almost anything that's got raw materials from here, some other processing done somewhere else, some other ingredients then injected from somewhere else, some other components then that are brought in from somewhere else, final assembly in yet another place, and then exported somewhere. So that's not easy to sort out, but it is theoretically possible under rules that are actually fairly clear. Other countries have different rules around country of origin, some of which are simpler, some of which are more complex. But my point is only that most countries do have a mechanism for sorting that out. And in most cases, that mechanism is quite well established and frequently employed. And so the real question is just, do you have the legal capacity, essentially, to adjudicate that if you want to now make this a political issue, rather than do we have rules to understand it? Yes, we do, actually. In this question on transshipment of, can you send something somewhere, that really speaks to my point of how many steps forward do we want to go rather than how many steps backward. If you think of sort of the chain of production and custody of an object, right, from the earliest raw materials to the eventual person holding it now, right, usually what we're talking about is the point at which it becomes a quote-unquote finished product that gets sold on to a final user. And usually what we're talking about, and what your first question kind of implied, is working backwards from that. How many steps backwards, and in what way do we understand that in order to understand where this came from? The second question to me is more interesting and much harder to sort out politically rather than legally or technically, because it's not really a technical or legal question. It's a question of how many steps forward do you want to try to control, and do you have the capacity to control for where that product goes after some person has gotten hold of it, right? So you have your phone. What you do with it, by some measure, is your business, right? It's not for me to tell you you're not allowed to give it to him, right? Or you're not allowed to destroy it, or you're not allowed to sell it on a secondary market or whatever it is. But what's being said now with some of this transshipment talk and some of the issues on export controls is, yes, it is the government's business. And the question is how many steps, to what degree, and in what way, and with what capacity to enforce. And I think those are very much still open questions when it comes to most things.
But look, I think these transshipment issues, they're more technical questions than policy questions. So policy will set the broad. I mean, obviously, you've got to have the technical, background. But whether the widget was put together in Mexico or Canada or Britain, if there's a blanket 30% tariff, it becomes an academic question. The main question around that is what the rate of the tariff is. That seems to me what the debate should be around.
So I think I wanted to say something on this because from a different perspective, if you look at how hard it is to do a modern slavery audit of an item, and I had an acquaintance who had been commissioned to do a modern slavery audit of a hotel room of a big hotel chain, and they said, we want to know which items in our room at some point in the chain of production might have had bad practice done on individuals or on the environment in all of these, the trouser press, the beds, the lights, the shoe shining equipment. And they tried to track all the way through how you made everything. And the conclusion was, it is not possible on any of the items in the hotel room to say that there has not been exploitation of human beings or destruction of the environment in the production of those things. And the reason, so I think you might say it's a sort of side point, but it's the big macro point, which is that all of these supply chains lead back to bad practice, mostly in China, but not entirely in China. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that we're going to be able to get a handle on this transshipment stuff because we
I agree with that. I mean, that's why, people like McKinley, forgive me, can I just say that one point on that? If it's a blanket tariff, which the Republicans fostered for 130 years, it doesn't matter about that. They had, the tariff that McKinley imposed was 49% on all goods from around the world. They didn't have the sort of sweetheart deals.
In 1896.
It was in 1890. It was in 1890, but that
No, I just wanted. I was just the bit that Bill made me think about there as well on the dual use things. And do you remember the supergun thing? It was a bunch of British inventors who accidentally, or I don't know. I mean, I can't. But the point is, it is entirely possible to make something in all innocence that ends up then being exported and used in ways that you wouldn't have intended. So I think this issue is a fascinating one that is going to dominate actually the discussions that we have.
I couldn't agree more, and I think actually one of the things that's going to have to happen, I'll tell you what, Kwasi, I'll give you a panic attack by using the term technological solutions to the border. Like, we've been here before. I will say one thing. If in the world you describe of a blanket 30% tariff, you'd be absolutely right that this isn't an issue.
and that's where we were in the 19th century. That's only the point.
It's also the world of the WTO. Because, I swear to God, because the whole point of most favored nation status is you can't discriminate on the tariff rate. If the tariff's at 30% on one country, it has to be at 30% on all the countries. What Trump has done is thrown that out of the window. We now have a 10% tariff on Venezuela. Oh, no, not Venezuela, they're under sanctions. Bad example. We have a 30% tariff on China and a 20% tariff on country X. And in that world, transshipment isn't a technical issue. It's absolutely fundamental.
Adam has the final. Oh no, we've got two. Jack's got a question as well. I'll take the last one. Well, why don't we get both your questions and then we'll ask each of them to give brief answers and then you can have a drink. Go ahead.
So my question really is a very big picture one because what I take away from not just the panel discussion but across the day is that we can add the WTO to the list of multilateral organisations that really isn't functioning in the way that it was intended. And that I would, when you put that against the fact that's true also of the UN, it's also true of the Bretton Woods institutions, it's also true of NATO. I'd like you to just offer us some thoughts on where a middle to upper ranking economic power like the UK, how it begins to plot its behaviour in a world where two things are no longer as constant as they were once. One, the predictability of US government policy, and two, a reliable multilateral system that does what it was supposed to do.
Thank you. And Jack?
You can just do that one. That's a big enough question.
We'll have a chat later. Am I going first again?
Yeah, I'll go first.
So I think if we've learned one thing in this panel, it's that the answer to that question is really hard, and lots of people have lots of different views. We've disagreed a bit, but one place where actually Kwasi and I are in complete agreement is that one of the keys for the UK is to be flexible and dynamic, as we can be outside of the European Union. And for all of the challenges and difficulties that Brexit produced, we are now in a position where we can be more nimble in what we negotiate and what we do in the trade space, whether that's with the United States, where we can now take advantage of how well we are trusted in security terms to benefit in terms of market access, whether that's with the European Union, where we can negotiate not as within an EU system, but in terms of a common understanding of the Russian threat, whether that's joining key coalitions that share certain interests in the rules of the road, like CPTPP, whether that's finding a close and meaningful relationship with Japan, one of the countries who's most similar to us in this time. We can move around. We can think dynamically. That is a consequence of Brexit, and we need to lean into it, as, to be fair, this government is trying to do. To do that requires an effective state and effective statecraft. It requires the building of expertise within the British state, and it requires us to get out there and get stuck in, listen to industry, listen to business, find people we can trust in that community, and build. That's all perfectly possible. That's not the same thing as saying it's easy.
I think in actually a somewhat similar vein, I would say, there is an old sort of maxim in Indonesian foreign policy that says the goal of diplomacy should be to have 1,000 friends and 0 enemies. I wouldn't quite say that should be the goal for a UK foreign policy, but I would say it's important now to be very careful about which enemies one chooses, whether that be an enemy state or non-state actor, or an issue or problem that is a focus of negative attention, and to try to restrain that number to something very small and that are there for very, very good reasons, and consistently so. And so by doing that, that then does leave open the space to, as Hugo put it, think dynamically and forge lots of partnerships and other positive relationships that can both support UK economic growth and development, but also any security aims that would be there, mostly constraining or containing those enemies, whether they be states, issues, or non-state actors. And I think it wouldn't be too hard for most people across most areas of the political spectrum, actually, to sit down and think and probably agree fairly quickly on a short list of what those enemy issues, states, or actors should look like. And there'd probably be a very high degree of overlap and not a very long list. So in that sense, I think that would be the first path forward, be to have a political consensus around that, and then to start thinking in a more technical way or policy way rather than political way about how to craft those positive relationships to constrain the negative ones.
So look, I'm in broad agreement with the panel. You'll be surprised to hear. I think Adam's characterization of international institutions isn't. I don't quite share that. I think some of them work. I think NATO works. I think Bretton Woods. I mean, it's such a long time ago, but the IMF is still there. The World Bank is still functioning. I do a lot of work in Africa. They're big players there. I think WTO is dead, and I don't really want to replace it. I don't think it's necessary, but we can have a chat over that over lunch. Over dinner. And I think the UN is an institution which has its challenges, but no one would ever conceive of getting rid of it. Only the far fringes of the Republican Party would want to ditch that. And so I think broadly, Britain has to do what it has done for hundreds of years and be very nimble about the alliances that it builds and the trading partnerships that it wants to enter into. And you've got to remember, over the 700 years or whatever, 1066, so how long is that? 1,000 years, whatever. The EU was only a small part of that. And if you look at trading patterns before we're in the EU, just very lastly, people always say to me, but 50% of our trade was with the EU. But that's a circular argument because it's 50% because we were in it for 50 years. If if you look at the trading relationships before we went there, 67% was outside the bloc. So I'm not saying we would go back to that, but we have to be more global and we have to be able to be more nimble, as Hugo described.
Thank you. Tremendous panel. That was a bit of a job. I think that, Hugo, you said we need certainty and we need time, and that's because you're young and you think it's possible to have certainty and time. But those of us who have lived a bit longer know that you don't ever get either of those.
There's a role for naive optimism in statecraft, isn't there?
But we have run out of time now, so please enthusiastically thank our panel, Hugo, Bill and Kwasi. Join me.